There are moments that don't shout but stay with you like a shadow. It starts with something so ordinary. A woman walks into a building holding a folder. Nothing loud, nothing wrong, just a quiet step into the machinery of justice. But sometimes, the quietest steps land in the deepest cracks. And when no one looks, when no one listens, your name, your life, your dignity can vanish into the folds of a system that was never built to recognize you. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, carrying the weight of everything she'd done right, and watched as the world treated her like a mistake. And still, she stayed. What happens when the person they try to erase is the one who taught them how to read? This is the story of Ellen Gray. And once you hear it, you'll understand why silence was never the end, just the beginning. The wind in Camden that morning was sharp, the kind that slips beneath coat collars and stings without warning. Leaves, brittle and orange, scraped along the sidewalk outside the Camden County Courthouse like whispers no one was listening to. The sun barely reached the concrete through the steel-gray clouds above, casting the whole morning in a cold, indifferent light. Ellen Gray stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps. One hand rested on the metal railing, the other clutched a manila folder to her chest. Inside it, 2 bank statements, a handwritten letter, and a notarized form she had spent 3 weeks requesting. All of it was to clarify a bureaucratic error about her late husband's pension. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, a clerical mess, that's all. She just needed to submit the papers in person, as instructed. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and took a steadying breath. 68 winters had taught her how to walk into cold places without flinching. This one would be no different. Except it was. Inside the courthouse lobby, fluorescent lights hummed like static. The line at the security checkpoint was short, just a young man with sagging jeans, a woman with a stroller, and her. Ellen's steps were slow but sure. She smiled gently at the officer behind the metal detector. He didn't smile back. "Bag," he said flatly. She placed her worn leather purse on the conveyor belt, then her coat, then hesitated before setting down the manila folder. "You can hold the papers, ma'am," another officer said without looking up. Ellen gave a small nod of thanks. But just as she stepped forward, something beeped, a soft chirp from the scanner. "Ma'am, step back." She froze. "I don't think I have." "Step back." The first officer's voice had shifted, firm now, and louder. Ellen raised her hands slightly, not in fear, in muscle memory. They wanded her. The scanner chirped again when it passed over her hip. "My belt buckle," she offered quietly. The officer didn't respond. He signaled to someone behind the desk. A third officer walked over. They spoke in low tones, glancing toward her, then down at a tablet screen. Ellen's stomach tightened. Something about their silence was louder than shouting. "Name? Ellen Gray." The tablet was passed to the senior officer. His eyes flicked to hers. His posture straightened. "There's a bench warrant for your arrest." The words didn't register. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He looked past her. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Her throat tightened. "There must be a mistake. I'm just here to drop off." "No." The folder fell from her hands. Papers scattered across the floor like spilled leaves. A woman in the line gasped. A child tugged on his mother's sleeve. No one moved. The cuffs clicked shut with practiced efficiency. Cold steel against aging skin. Ellen didn't cry. Not then. She looked up past the officers, past the silent stairs. Her eyes landed on the marble plaque above the entranceway. Equal justice under law. It didn't feel ironic. It just felt cruel. She sat on a hard bench in a holding room tucked in the basement of the courthouse. No windows. Just the dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional buzz of a door unlocking somewhere down the hallway. Her purse had been taken. Her coat, too. The scarf her daughter-in-law had knitted for Christmas last year was balled in a plastic bin beside the booking desk. They hadn't told her why she was being held. Just a warrant, nothing more. They hadn't asked if she had medication. They hadn't offered water. They hadn't even looked her in the eye since the cuffs came out. Ellen sat perfectly still, hands folded, shoulders straight, a librarian's posture. She'd taught herself years ago to sit like this when she was afraid. Gave people fewer reasons to judge her. Less noise, less suspicion. Across the room, a young officer glanced at her, then quickly back to his phone. A civilian clerk, maybe no older than 20, typed, without pause. Ellen wanted to ask what the charge was. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say, "I've lived here for 47 years. I built reading programs for schools that didn't have books. I taught kids how to spell their names when their parents couldn't read street signs." But no one asked, and so she said nothing. Instead, she stared at the reflection of her face in the window glass. It was warped slightly by the tint. Her features looked softer, older, like a version of herself she hadn't quite met yet. When the clerk finally called her name, it wasn't with recognition. It was with the same tone someone uses to call a table at a fast food restaurant. "Gray." She stood. They processed her quickly. Photographs, fingerprints, a form shoved across the desk. "Sign here." "What am I signing?" "Standard booking." She stared at the form, then down at the signature line. No explanation, no clarification, just a blank line waiting to swallow her name. She signed. Because what else was there to do? The holding cell smelled like bleach and old rubber. A row of narrow benches lined the wall. Metal toilet in the corner. Flickering light above. A woman in her 20s sat hunched in the far corner. Braids pulled back into a loose ponytail. Arms wrapped around her knees like armor. Ellen took the opposite corner. She didn't speak. Neither did the young woman. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time in places like this didn't move the same. Then the woman spoke quiet, rough. "They think you stole something too?" Ellen looked up. "No, at least I don't think so." The girl nodded slowly, not surprised. "I took diapers," she said. "Couldn't wait for the WIC card to reset. My baby's 2 weeks old." Ellen's heart sank. She looked at the girl's bare feet, then at the loose paper scrubs they'd given her. The girl gave a bitter chuckle. "They said I'm dangerous. For diapers." Ellen didn't speak. She just listened. "I didn't even know what they meant at first," the girl continued. "I just wanted to get home. I thought maybe they'd give me a warning or something. But then the cuffs came out, and no one looked at me, like I wasn't even real." That last part landed like glass shattering inside Ellen's chest. Like I wasn't even real. She sat in that cell long after the young woman was escorted out. The room felt colder now, bigger in a cruel way. Somewhere above her, courtrooms buzzed with life. Lawyers made arguments. Judges tapped gavels. People in pressed suits walked in and out of doors that would never open for women like her unless someone forced them. And Ellen thought about her son. Malcolm, state representative, youngest ever elected in Camden County, a voice on the news, a name on bills, a promise in a room full of silence. He had asked her last month just offhand if she wanted to move in with him in Trenton. She had laughed, told him Camden was still home, told him she was fine. She was not fine now, but she would not call him. Not yet. This was her life, her mistake to fix, whatever it was. Besides, what would it say if she reached out now? That even after everything he had built, his mother still ended up in a concrete box with flickering lights and no answers. No. Ellen Gray had taught generations how to speak up, how to question, how to read the fine print. She had helped rewrite policies for school libraries, fought for funding in city council chambers, stood up to parents who wanted certain books banned. And now the world had turned on her like she was a footnote in someone else's narrative. She closed her eyes. The quote on the courthouse wall replayed in her head. Equal justice under law. And for the first time, she let herself ask, was it ever meant for people like her? The second night in custody always felt heavier, not just because of the thin blanket or the aching joints, but because of the silence. Ellen Gray lay curled on a bench, meant for someone half her size, her back pressed against the concrete wall, her body stiff from the chill that settled deep in her bones. She hadn't eaten since breakfast the day before toast and peach jam, the last jar she'd made before the winter. No one had offered her anything but a stale sandwich in a plastic wrapper, left untouched on the floor beside the bench. It was the quiet that consumed her most. Not the kind that calms or comforts, the kind that presses down on the lungs, the kind that says, "You don't matter enough to make noise for." She had tried briefly asking a guard for a phone call that afternoon. The man, barely 30, with earbuds in and a badge too new to be scuffed, hadn't looked up from his clipboard. "I'm sorry," she had said, voice steady but fraying at the edges. "Could I make a call?" "Not my call," he mumbled, then walked away. That was it. No explanation, no paperwork, no name, just nothing. Ellen sat back down, folded her hands again like a schoolgirl waiting for permission that never came. The hours blurred into each other. The fluorescent lights never dimmed. There was no night in that place, only rotations of footsteps, echoing down the hallway, and the occasional metallic clang of doors that opened for everyone but her. She thought of her garden, her tiny square of soil behind the duplex. Her tomatoes had been coming in strong. She'd meant to prune the basil before the cold snap. She wondered if her neighbor, Mrs. Lovell, had noticed she was gone. Probably not. Ellen had never been loud enough to miss. She didn't cry. That surprised even her. She'd always thought if she ended up in a place like this, if the world ever turned on her, this fully tears would be inevitable. But they never came. Instead, what came was a memory. 3rd grade. Her teacher, Mrs. Knowles, calling her unnecessarily combative for questioning why only white students got to read from the new history books. That was the first time she'd felt the silence, the weaponized kind, the one that swallows your truth before it ever finds breath. She'd carried that moment for 60 years, and now here she was again. Same silence, different uniform. In the afternoon, she was moved. 2 guards-silent. Professional opened the cell and motioned her out. No words, no explanation, just gestures. She was treated like a liability, not a person, as if her age and softness were a disguise for something criminal. They walked her through a narrow hallway, past holding cells filled with murmurs and metal beds, past graffiti-scrawled walls and old vending machines blinking out of order. Then they stopped at a side room with a steel table and 2 chairs. Ellen was told to sit. A man entered. Thin tie, thin patience, a public defender. He didn't say hello, didn't introduce himself. He dropped a folder on the table and opened it without looking at her. "Gray, right?" She nodded. "Look," he sighed. "You were flagged in a warrant sweep from 2019. Some kind of clerical confusion, maybe. They say your name's attached to an unpaid summons." "I've never had a summons," she said. He didn't look up. "Well, you do now." Ellen leaned forward. "Sir, I'm a retired librarian. I've lived in the same address for 25 years. I've never missed a jury duty notice. This isn't right." He flipped a page. "Yeah, happens more than you'd think. But we're not fighting that today." She stared at him. "We're not?" "No. Judge wants to move quick. I can probably get you a plezomething light. A fine, maybe probation." She blinked. "A plea? For what?" He shrugged. "Failure to appear. They'll argue you ignored the original notice. The paper trail's messy, but judges don't like clutter. Cleanest way out is to just take the deal." Ellen's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "Cleanest for who?" she whispered. Finally, the man looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw it not cruelty, not malice, just fatigue, the kind that turns people into systems without even realizing it. "You want to go home, Miss Gray?" he asked. "Then take the deal." When he left, she sat alone in the room for 15 minutes. She thought about the people she'd taught, the kids who didn't know how to pronounce abolish or amendment until she wrote it on the board. She thought about the program she built, the city grants she fought for. She thought about how often she told others, "Don't sign anything you don't understand." And now she was being asked to sign away her name. No one would remember her side. There'd be no headline, no article, no photo, just a record that said, "Failure to appear," and a system that never asked why. She pressed her palms flat against the table and stood. Her knees ached, but her spine stayed straight. Back in the holding cell, the young officer was Back Officer Delgado, she thought his badge had said. He lingered a little longer this time, when delivering her water. His eyes paused on her face. "You all right, ma'am?" Ellen nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated, then said quietly, "There's gonna be an arraignment tomorrow morning. You'll see the judge. Might be able to speak then." She gave a faint smile. "If they let me." He looked down, said nothing. But for the first time, she saw the doubt. A tiny crack in the mask, the beginning of a question he hadn't yet formed. It wasn't enough, but it was something. That night, she curled beneath the thin blanket again and stared at the ceiling. What had happened to her wasn't a mistake. Not really. A mistake implies someone meant well. This was neglect. Indifference layered over procedure. It wasn't the system breaking down. It was the system working exactly as it was built to. And Ellen was too old, too black, too quiet for it to care. Still, somewhere beneath the weight of it all, a thought stirred. I will not be reduced to paperwork. Morning arrived with the sound of keys. "Gray," the guard called. "Courtroom in 10. As she stood, she caught a glimpse of her reflection again, this time in the steel toilet's curved edge. The same face, but harder, not bitter, clear. She didn't know what would happen in that courtroom. She didn't know if anyone would believe her, or listen, or care. But for the first time since she was dragged out of that lobby, Ellen Gray felt her voice again. It wasn't loud, but it was ready. The courtroom was colder than the cell. Not physically, but in its spirit. The walls were lined with dull wood paneling, and the seal of the Camden Municipal Court hung above the judge's bench like a symbol no one looked at anymore. Everything about the room felt distant too clean, too rehearsed, like a play that had been performed 1,000 times without meaning. Ellen sat at the defense table in a plain beige jumper, her hair pulled back, her glasses slightly crooked. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, fingers twisting over each other as if they were trying to keep her from disappearing. She wasn't shackled, but the silence around her had its own weight. Her public defender sat beside her, checking his phone. He hadn't looked at her since they entered the room. In front of them, a Judge White, mid-60s, robe crisp, nameplate reading Honorable Daniel Markley flipped through his morning docket like a man browsing coupons. Case 17. B. State of New Jersey versus Ellen Gray. The clerk called it with all the enthusiasm of a checkout beep. Ellen's name echoed through the room like a bell no one wanted to hear. The prosecutor stood. Young, ambitious, pressed gray suit, confident jawline, voice like he'd practiced it in mirrors. "Your Honor," he began, "we're dealing with a warrant issued following a failure to appear regarding a financial discrepancy tied to the 2019 city housing audit." Ellen blinked. This was new. The public defender didn't flinch, didn't correct him, didn't glance at her. The prosecutor continued, "Due to the defendant's age and the minor nature of the issue, we're willing to recommend a minimal fine and a no-contest plea provided she acknowledges the administrative error and waives her right to further litigation." It was said so quickly, so efficiently, that for a moment it didn't even feel real. Judge Markley raised an eyebrow. "Is the defendant prepared to enter a plea?" Her lawyer stood halfway. "Your Honor, we'd advise she accept the offer. I'd like to speak." The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. The lawyer paused, startled. The judge looked up. Ellen's voice was calm, too calm, like water right before it boils. "I'd like to speak," she repeated. "On the record." Judge Markley frowned. "Ms. Gray, your attorney is here to represent your interests." "I understand that," she said, "but I am the one whose life this affects, and I believe I'm still allowed to speak in a room like this." A flicker of movement at the back of the courtroom. The door creaked open. A man stepped inside, tall, tailored navy suit, dreadlocks pulled back in a tight, neat bun. His eyes scanned the room once before, locking onto the woman seated at the defense table. He didn't sit, didn't speak. He just watched. Ellen didn't turn around, but she felt him. Malcolm, her son. Judge Markley cleared his throat. You may proceed briefly. Ellen rose slowly. The courtroom didn't lean forward. It didn't hush itself. But something shifted. I came here 2 days ago, she began, to submit documents. That's all. My husband passed in 2019, and his pension was misclassified. I followed every instruction I was given to fix it. I waited in line. I brought the right forms. I stood where I was told. She looked at the prosecutor, and I was arrested. A pause. They said I had a warrant, that I failed to appear. No one asked if I'd ever been notified. No one checked the file. No one explained what I supposedly missed. Her voice didn't tremble. It sharpened. For 42 years, I worked in this city's libraries. I ran after-school reading programs when the state cut funding. I taught parents how to navigate online school portals. I helped grandmothers fill out SNAP applications because no one else would. And for all those years, I told people believe in the system. That if you show up, if you follow the rules, if you stay calm and patient, the system will work for you. She looked directly at Judge Markley now. But I was wrong. Silence. Real silence. The kind that isn't empty, but full of truth no one wants to touch. I have no criminal record. I pay my taxes. I volunteer. And yet I spent 2 nights in a cell. Was offered a deal to admit fault for something I didn't do. I was told that was easier. Easier for who? She scanned the courtroom. I wasn't treated like a person. I was treated like a number. A misfiled form. An error someone didn't want to fix because it would take more than 10 minutes. She turned to her lawyer. Sir, you don't know me, but you decided I wasn't worth fighting for. He lowered his gaze. I don't want a deal. I don't want mercy. I want a correction. I want to know how many other names are buried under lazy data entry and silence. How many elderly women have signed away their dignity just to make the discomfort stop? Now she turned to the gallery, and her eyes finally met Malcolm's. For once, she said, I want someone in this room to look at me and say, you matter enough to fix this. No one spoke. Even the judge stayed still. The young prosecutor cleared his throat, but it cracked halfway. Your Honor, he said softly, perhaps we should request a continuance. Review the documentation more thoroughly. The judge hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Motion granted. As the gavel struck wood, the courtroom seemed to exhale. But Ellen didn't sit. Not yet. She turned to her son. He stepped forward. Just one step. Not as a lawmaker, not as a man in a suit, but as a child who had just seen the world finally hear his mother's voice. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned a pale blue, cold but clear. Malcolm stood beside Ellen on the steps, coat open, tie loose, anger and awe still visible in the set of his jaw. You should have called me, he said quietly. She looked ahead. I needed to know if they'd listen without your name in the room. He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. They didn't, but they heard me. A long silence. Then Malcolm exhaled. Let me help now. She turned toward him. I know, she said. That's why I waited. That afternoon, he filed a formal inquiry into Camden's municipal data protocols. By evening, a reporter had picked up the court transcript. By morning, Ellen Gray's name was trending across the state. Not because she shouted, not because she broke, but because, for the first time in that courtroom, silence lost. The media storm didn't last long. A few interviews. A morning show request Ellen politely declined. An op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer titled, The Librarian Who Silenced a Courtroom. Then the noise moved on as it always does. But Ellen didn't. She had no interest in viral justice. She wanted something that would last. 2 weeks after the hearing, Ellen sat in a small, sunlit room on the second floor of Camden's Public Service Annex. A folding table, a carafe of lukewarm coffee, 5 plastic chairs, and a whiteboard with no markers. Across from her sat Councilman Jerry Brooks, City Clerk Alicia Wynne, and a young woman from the mayor's office named Tasha, who had 3 pens and took notes like every syllable might change something. They had invited Ellen for community input. What they got was a blueprint. She had spent the last 10 days combing through the city's public complaint portal, highlighting reports of misfiled warrants, unanswered summonses, and dozens of stories like her stories that never made it to courtrooms because people simply gave up before getting that far. She laid them out, calm, precise, measured. She didn't shout. She didn't blame. She taught, just like she always had. "I'm not here to burn the courthouse down," she said. "I'm here to build a window in it." They listened, not because of the news cycle, not because of her name, but because the system, for a moment, had run into someone who spoke in a language it had forgotten, clarity without anger, truth without theater. By the 3rd meeting, Ellen had been asked to co-chair a working group for senior citizens navigating municipal records. By the 4th, she had a badge, not a real one, but a laminated visitor's pass that read, Citizen Advisor, E. Gray. The public defender who once ignored her reached out to apologize. She declined the call, not out of resentment, but because she didn't need the apology. She needed him to do better. At home, things changed too. Her mailbox filled with letters, not praise, not sympathy, but stories. From women in Arkansas, from a veteran in Chicago, from a single mother in Newark who wrote, "I didn't think quiet people won. You showed me we do." Malcolm visited more often, not as the busy son balancing policy and interviews, but as a student again. He sat with her at the kitchen table, took notes as she explained which city forms were impossible to read, which websites crashed too often, how automated phone lines excluded anyone without a smartphone. He drafted a bill, but the language? That came from her. She didn't want her name in the legislation. She wanted it to work. She asked for one thing only: make sure someone picks up the phone. In February, Camden launched a pilot program, Clarity Community Legal Access, Records Interface for the Aging. It was small, just a 3-person desk at the courthouse, staffed with trained volunteers and one full-time clerk who actually cared. But for the first time, when someone like Ellen walked through the courthouse doors, they weren't met with suspicion. They were met with a question: how can I help you understand this? The judge, who once barely looked at her, never reached out. She didn't expect him to. But at the courthouse coffee kiosk one morning, she saw him waiting in line behind her. She turned, met his eyes, and for a second, just 1 second, he hesitated, then gave her a nod. Small, tight, hollow. She didn't nod back, not out of defiance, but because acknowledgement, when it comes too late, isn't worth returning. One day in March, she returned to the same security checkpoint where it all began. The same lobby, the same cold marble floor. But this time, when the scanner beeped an earring, the guard smiled. "You're all good, Miss Gray." She smiled back, not because the scanner let her through, but because now someone saw her. Later that week, she met with a new group of volunteers in the basement of a community center. Mostly women, mostly black and brown. Some with legal experience, most without. But all had one thing in common: they'd been ignored before. Ellen stood before them, no microphone, no podium, no applause. Just her, and said, "You don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to know what they hope you never find out: that silence is easier to maintain than truth is to correct. And that's where we come in." One woman raised her hand. "How will we know it's working?" Ellen smiled. "When people stop thanking you for listening, that's when you'll know they expect to be heard." She walked home that night alone, cold wind on her cheeks. She passed the old library she used to work at, now shuttered for renovations. A child's drawing was taped to the boarded-up window. A stick-figure woman with a book, 3 words written in crayon. Miss Ellen helped. She stood there for a moment. Not proud, not sad, just still. Because dignity, when it's real, doesn't need an audience. It just needs time. The new branch of the Camden Public Library didn't open with ribbon-cutting or speeches. No cameras, no podium, just sunlight through tall windows and the smell of fresh paint and unopened books. It stood on the corner of East 4th and Harding once, a vacant lot, now transformed by a community grant Malcolm had quietly pushed through in the state assembly. But the idea had always been his mother's. Inside, the reading room was simple. White walls, warm oak shelves, thick carpets designed to muffle sound but not voices. A single plaque hung above the fireplace mantel at the far end. No gilding, no gold. Just 3 words engraved into brushed steel. The Ellen Gray Room. Beneath it, in smaller letters, for those who were once unheard. On the first day it opened, a group of 4th graders from East Side Elementary filed in. They took off their coats in clumps, sat cross-legged on the floor. Some whispered, others giggled. They were waiting for a story. Ellen sat in a wide-backed chair near the fireplace, the same kind she used to read from decades ago. Her eyes scanned the room not for grandeur, but for recognition. Not one of them knew what she'd been through. That was the point. This wasn't a monument to what had happened to her. It was a place to make sure it didn't happen again. As she opened the book, a boy near the back raised his hand. "Miss Gray? Yes? Why's this room got your name?" The other kids turned to look. Ellen paused. She thought of the cell, of the cold, of the bench and the blinking lights, of the feeling of being erased. Then she smiled. "Because once," she said, "I asked a question no one wanted to answer, and instead of walking away, I stayed until someone did." The boy nodded like he understood. Maybe not all of it, but enough. Later that week, Malcolm visited the room alone. He stood in front of the plaque for a long time, hands in his coat pockets. The library was quiet. No interviews, no crowds, just the faint rustle of pages being turned behind him. He ran his fingers along the engraved name. His mother's name. She had never asked for it, had even objected when the city offered, but he insisted. "You didn't make noise, Mama," he had said, "but you made space." At home, Ellen still kept the same small notebook on her kitchen table. Same cracked cover, same neat handwriting. But the pages were different now. No more lists of wrongs to correct. Just names. People she'd helped through the new Legal Access Center. Neighbors she referred. Volunteers she trained. It wasn't legacy. It was continuity. One night, as she sat watching the window collect dusk, Malcolm called. He didn't ask how she was. He knew. Instead, he said, "I passed your room today. There were 4 kids reading out loud to each other." Ellen's voice was soft. Were they listening to each other? They were. She smiled. Then that room's doing its job. The next morning, she walked to the library early, before the staff, before the students. The door was already unlocked. Inside, sunlight stretched across the carpet in long, silent stripes. Ellen moved to the chair, sat down, folded her hands. Not as someone waiting for justice, but as someone who had already planted it, in silence, and watched it grow. Have you ever been in a room where your voice didn't matter? Where the truth was in your hands, but no one bothered to ask? Where you weren't seen as a person, just a problem to process? Ellen Gray didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand revenge. She chose something much harder, to stay. To stay with grace. To stay with clarity. To stay until someone finally listened. Her story reminds us that dignity doesn't need to shout, it just needs space to stand. If you've ever felt overlooked, misunderstood, or silenced, know this: you are not alone. And silence doesn't mean you're wrong, it just means the room hasn't caught up to your truth yet. So here's the invitation. Keep showing up. Keep asking questions. Hold on to your voice even when it trembles because it still matters. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment, your thoughts, your story. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that honor the quiet strength in all of us. Because, as Ellen taught us, you don't have to scream to be heard, you just have to stay until someone listens. See you in the next story. Stay tuned.